Alleluia. Om Mani Padme. Om. Allah.
Welcome to Harmony and Diversity. Norm Currie is my name. Today we have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Rabbi Shimon Cowen. And he's been expounding about the universal ethical principles which are based on the Noahide laws. And I'd like to ask you, Rabbi, to just elucidate that a bit. Give us a bit of an idea where that might be growing from.
With pleasure. Well, the name Noahide might fall strangely on many ears. Now, Noahide actually comes from the name Noah. As people with some acquaintance with the Bible know that there was a person who survived the great flood, and his name was Noah. And he had some of his immediate family with him. And from him came the regeneration of humanity. Hence, we speak about, in some sense, humanity as Noahides. All humanity, they come from Noah. But what is particularly significant here is that with this, let's say, recommencement of civilization, there was the completion also of a covenant with Noah, and hence with all humanity, which now embodied 7 universal laws. Mm-hmm. These 7 universal laws were there from the beginning of creation. Well, to tell you the truth, 6 were. A 7th was added with Noah. And then these laws travel on through the generations of humanity to Abraham. Abraham is 10 generations from Noah. Mm-hmm. And of course, everybody knows that Abraham is a seminal figure. He's been the father of Judaism, of Christianity, of Islam. What people don't know is that the Bible talks of him sending certain of his sons off to the east. And there he had actually a seminal impact on the origins of Hinduism and its ultimate offshoot, Buddhism. So you see, these 5 world religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and Buddhism, which account for 75% of the world's population, were touched by Abraham and his teachings. And his teachings were primarily the Noahide laws. Now these universal laws, which on the one hand are both broad but also contain a great deal of detail, were reiterated at Sinai. Everybody knows about the 10 Commandments. Now the 10 Commandments were the core of a general revelation, which are known as the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch.
Yes.
Now, in fact, this comprehensive revelation consists of 613 laws which were given to the Jewish people, and 7 universal laws were reiterated for humanity. Now, those 7 universal laws also overlap with many of the 613 of the Jewish people. But the basic point I want to make here is that the laws of Noah, the Noahide laws, by which Abraham lived, they were reiterated at Sinai. Mm. And what is of significance for us, therefore, is that just as a text was given, a biblical text came to us from Sinai, and there were commentaries were given, and also a tradition of commentary began there and then, so it is also, therefore, that we're able to elaborate this code, which is a root code for the world religions, which the world religions elaborated, to which they added many of their own aspects of their own faith. But this, if you like, you could be called the Abrahamic stem religion. And it's very important that we study this, because this really is the common legacy and the common spiritual rallying point of all humanity. And this is something which comes up throughout history. It was at the time of the Renaissance. 2 great jurists, one a Dutchman, Hugo Grotius, and an Englishman, John Selden, proposed, and they were not particularly religious people, they were secular scholars, so maybe they were believers as well, but they proposed the Noahide laws as the foundations of international law and municipal, which means local, domestic law. And in our time, in the year 1991, the American Congress, in a preamble to its Education Day bill, described the Noahide laws as the bedrock of society since the dawn of civilization. And in 2008, the Australian Governor-General, who was Major General Michael Jeffrey, described the Noahide laws also as applying to every facet of life. So you see, this is a tradition which goes back to the origins of humanity, but in a highly explicit manner back to Mount Sinai 3,300 years ago. And even though it sort of comes in and out of consciousness, we're living in a time where it's extremely important for us to now elaborate and be aware of this common spiritual heritage of humanity.
Yes, I remember in an earlier conversation you mentioned something about one of the points of where it seemed to relate to Hinduism, and that was the term Brahman. Is that, would you explain what that...
Well, this is a very interesting area for research, because even though we think of Hinduism as something which is somewhat different from the classic monotheistic religions, nevertheless they did go down, and Abraham and Brahman are cognate terms, and the notion of the eternity of the soul and the journey of the soul, in a way, is elaborated from Abraham into the Hindu doctrines of karma and dharma, and so here we have a point with the East, a point of connection with the East of this shared set of ethics and laws embodied in a common root consciousness, that of Abraham.
This has massive implications for world communication and, at the end of that, peace, one would have thought.
Most certainly. Unfortunately, people go to town on the so-called clash of civilizations and so on. I think that's really a political hijacking of religion. The real core of religion, in fact, if we look at the Noahide laws, is something which can evoke a common resonance and a common brotherhood and sisterhood of humanity. This is what we should be looking at. This is what we should be focusing on.
Thank you. It's time we'll take a break, and then we'll return to this fascinating discourse about the Noahide laws. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. Norm Currie is my name. And we're speaking with Rabbi Dr Shimon Cowen. And we're discussing the Noahide laws. Doctor, the Noahide laws, people mention them. What are they?
Right. Well, you know, there are several major departments, so to speak, of human activity which need regulation, which we need to know guidelines. One is that there is one in the dimension between the human being and his or her creator, which I would say these have to do with the concept of personal identity, and I'll explain that in a minute. Then there is between person and person. We used to call this between man and God and man, where that was the old-fashioned way of talking about it. Then there is also a third dimension of the human being's relationship to nature, the treatment of nature, the treatment of animals, and so on and so forth. Now, these 7 Noahide laws, we have 3 of them in each of the 2 major dimensions, between the person and his or her creator, and person, and one dealing with the natural world. The ones in the personal dimension relate, of course, in the first to the belief in God, or put negatively, an idea of a prohibition on idolatry. Idolatry simply means taking something which God created and making that absolute. Once you do that, you're on the wrong station. You have lost the address of ethics, because the concept of ethics, of course, is the ability of a human being to, if you like, transcend towards his or her own creator, to be receptive to that tradition which brings out the various spiritual resonances of the human soul, which is when it's dealing with its creator. That's first thing is, so belief in God, that's the first. Then there is one which, if you like, which is often called blasphemy. Well, blasphemy sounds like a rather fuddy-duddy word these days, but its real meaning has to do with the concept of the reverence for and the service of God. In other words, what is it that actually takes us from belief in God to the actual service, to which motivates us to elevate ourselves to serve God? In other words, and it has a positive and negative side. There is the disrespect for God, and there is the service of God. When we take an oath, for example, very often on a religious text, that obviously in a judicial context, that means that the authority by which we are taking this oath is something which we believe in. If I don't believe in it, then I have no reverence for that for that spiritual authority. So in general, the idea of the reverence for God is something which has to do with the whole motivational complex of the human being wanting to serve his or her creator, and the negative of that, the concept of the highly corrosive and negative attitude which devalues spiritual values, which devalues institutions built on spiritual ideals. And of course, unfortunately, our culture has a lot of that, a lot of derision and a lot of cynicism, and so on and so forth. So it's a two-sided thing.
Yes.
Let's call it generally the reverence for the divine.
Yep.
Then finally, in that department,
Yep.
you have the realm of sexual morality. Now, you may be very surprised to hear me call sexual morality something between the person and God. Well, the reason for that is that basically this has to do with the kind of unions into which the human being merges, and which of those unions actually defines the human being as a whole human being, such as a higher unit, a higher familial unit, or something which the human being then attains complete human identity. So the laws, in this realm, there are several prohibitions. There's a prohibition of adultery, which means, of course, straying outside one's own union. There's a prohibition of bestiality, it's understood, of relations with animals. And then there's a thirdly prohibition of incest. And finally, there's a prohibition of homosexuality. Now, this shouldn't be understood to be a posture which seeks to persecute or denounce one, but it states that the ultimate human norm is the union of man and woman. And this is where the person came from. This is how the person further projects humanity in a procreative sense. So this is a norm. Okay, so and I said this is between. So with all of these sexual relationships, it's irrelevant whether the parties which are prohibited are consenting to one or not. It's not a question of consent. It's not a question of harm. It's not like transactions in the financial sphere or something like that, where you could agree to something which would be disadvantageous, disagree or waive rights. No, it's irrelevant, and that's why it has to do with who we are and the unions in which we find our identity, proper identity. So that's why it's called between the human being and his or her creator. Now, in the realm between person and person, you have a comprehensive prohibition on theft, which actually takes in not just theft, but all kinds of damages and all kinds of those which regulate our interactions over matters of property and harm to another person's person or property or whatever it might be, as well as outright theft. There is also one of the Noahide laws is the law of justice. In other words, what is it that constitutes a proper justice system? What is the notion of justice? How should justice be implemented? And this is also one which supervises the performance of the other Noahide laws, but also sets out principles of justice, basic principles. And finally, in this interpersonal dimension, is a prohibition on killing, which of course has many dimensions. It's not just manslaughter, it's not just murder, it takes in manslaughter, it takes in euthanasia, it takes in abortion, it takes in all of these different areas, even self-killing and self-defense. It talks about all of these spheres, the prohibition of killing. Now that gives us three in the dimension also between person and person. And finally, there is a Noahide law which talks about the relationship to animals and to nature. Basically which states that a human being, where we were given permission to make use of the animal world, even to the extent of slaughtering animals to consume them. But gratuitous cruelty, unnecessary pain, and so on and so forth, is something which we have to be watchful for, which is actually prohibited. In addition to that, there's a concept of the proper use of resources, which is something which means that basically that once again the human being was meant to utilize natural resources and so on and so forth. But we have to see also which ways are destructive and unnecessary. So basically, you see, without going into further detail in our limited time, basically the whole matrix of human activity, whether in the personal, the interpersonal domain, or in the relationship with nature, is covered by these 7 basic laws. Three and a seventh, and but of course there is a mass of detail in each of these laws.
Absolutely.
But one way or another, we have covered, as a previous Governor General said, we've covered every aspect of social, personal, and natural existence.
They're certainly foundational as you go through those. It's quite astounding the influences that they have, and so particularly the sexual one, and also the one in relation to killing. Does suicide come into that as well?
Certainly it does. This is a very important issue. To go briefly into that, quite simply. You see, there are two, even there, but it requires a person's body and soul is not their own property to dispose of at will, and so the answer is yes. Suicide is something which is actually not permitted. But isn't a person allowed to give away their life? No. If a person says, "Kill that person, I'll kill you,"
yes,
then we say yes. In such an instance, a person could give away their life because who says that person's blood is redder than yours?
This is fascinating. We must take a break, and we'll be back to follow on with this Noahide law discussion. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. Norm Currie is my name. And we're speaking to Rabbi Dr Shimon Cowen, and we're covering a fascinating topic, the Noahide laws. And we've now laying those laws down as a foundation upon which a large portion of society and our historical development is based. And I'd like to ask you, Rabbi, what does that superstructure that's been built on those foundations look like? What are the variations of the designs? What have the architects done with it?
Right. Well, let me tell you first of all that really we can answer this in 2 ways. First of all, the Noahide laws are fundamental principles going back to the very beginnings of civilization. And I don't regard it, we don't look at civilization necessarily as something which is constant spiritual progress. To the contrary, it can be sometimes spiritual decline. So at all events, these principles, however, are acknowledged at the root of the world religions. Not every culture has necessarily throughout its history embodied these principles in their completeness. Our own society is a very developed one, but it's not necessarily does it get to it. Can we tick every single box to say that we're keeping all of these laws in their entirety? In certain areas we're doing well, in other areas we're not doing so well at all. So therefore, history, of course, is quite a checkered event. There have been dark moments and bright moments. So let's get it straight. For number one, we don't say that the Noahide laws have always been in operation in their entirety. There have been, unfortunately, moments of darkness, deep deviation from these universal values. But there is obviously some level of consciousness which hopefully brings us back to them. Now, the other question, which is related here, is, well, what's the connection between the way in which a society develops and in its particularity and these universal laws? I mean, if you go to Japan, particularly earlier, maybe these days people dress the same everywhere, but different countries had different kinds of costume. different kinds of architecture, different languages had different styles. These people drive on the right of the road, these people drive on the left of the road. There's a vast quantity of folklore and custom and national character and style and so on and so forth. And legislatures and cultures built up their own mass of law and custom and so on and so forth. That's fine. This is what we call, if you like, positive law. Positive law means the law which nations posit or legislate or make for themselves. Mm-hmm. Now, that's to be expected. The significance of the Noahide laws, however, are, if you like, guiding principles. This is, if you like, the skeleton on which the flesh of individual cultures is meant to grow. And of course, we don't expect those cultures to be identical in any way. But at all events, in terms of their character and their individual detail and folkways and laws and regulations. But there is a notion that the Noahide laws as overarching principles, as we just discussed a few moments, or the previous segment, that is something which is supposed to inform the actual concrete expressions and ways of life in a society. Nobody demands uniformity of character and style, or even detail in some ways. But at least here there are principles which need to be respected, and these are the broad principles upon which you can, if you like, hang a different kind of cloth according to the individual culture and society.
And there be the consequences from that. What sort of I'm minded of is in fact the skeleton, and that each of us is fleshed out in our own particular way. But if we don't take account of our skeleton, then we've got some issues, and the Noahide laws are laying that skeleton.
Correct. This is, if you like, one thing you'll find that the major Abrahamic religions speak about, and this is a biblical concept, is the human being was made in the image of God. And what that means is that the soul naturally mirrors and resonates with certain principles. That these principles structure our lives. This is what it is to be a godly human being.
Yes.
And to bring godliness into this world in the form of concrete conduct which embodies these virtues and these values. So yes, that is how the way the human being was meant to be for its purpose on earth. His or her purpose on earth. Now, you may wonder, for example, you look at a political system. There is diversity. How does that go with it? For most countries, most Western democracies, have at least two major parties. We have Labour, we have a coalition, we have Labour and Liberal Country Party or national parties on the one hand. The Americans have Democrats and Republicans, and so in England and so on and so forth, you'll always find some sort of a plurality of parties. That also is not a contradiction to the Noahide laws, because these are what I would call temperaments, personalities. Yes. And there can be different, and if you like, one of the most fundamental differences in political temperament is one which on the one hand stresses the individual, another which stresses more the state. In other words, or the collectivity. This is something very often in political systems. It's more the left-leaning parties, the socialists, which say we would ascribe a bigger role to the state in creating social justice. The parties more to the right, perhaps, are parties more of the individual, which say no, the primacy goes to the individual. However, whatever your if you like your predisposition is, whether you're more a collectivist or more an individualist, yes, you can still operate within the perimeter of the Noahide laws. And this is very important, because let's talk about charity, for example, or justice. Charity can be distributed through the state, through taxation, but individuals can also give charity. And so it is with justice and all the dimensions of things. There can be a different flavour in the implication, the application, so to speak, of these laws. But it is. So the main thing is that different parties with a natural diversity of temperament do not stray outside the fundamental rules governing human institutions. If a party goes outside then we have a big problem. They're out. Then that's a diversity which has gone too far.
Thank you, Rabbi. We've covered a huge topic here, and we need to talk more. Would you be happy to come on again next week?
It'll be a pleasure.
Thank you very much. You've been watching Harmony and Diversity, and next week we'll be looking at the Noahide laws in a more general way.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om.